Her brother went missing one summer night. 60 years later, a stranger returned with his watch. The porch light flickered against the summer twilight as Eleanor Hartwell dried her hands on the kitchen towel. At 75, she had grown accustomed to the quiet rhythms of living alone in the house where she'd spent her entire life. The same creaking floorboards, the same view of maple trees from the front window, the same ghosts that whispered in the corners when the wind picked up. She wasn't expecting visitors. In Millbrook, people didn't just drop by anymore, not like they used to when she was young, when neighbors would appear at your door with fresh pie or urgent gossip. These days, her phone rang maybe twice a week, and the mailman was often her only human contact for days at a time. So when the soft knock came at her front door, Eleanor's heart did a little skip. She set down the towel and padded through the living room, past the family photos that lined the mantel, past the worn sofa where she'd spent countless evenings reading mystery novels, trying to solve puzzles that weren't her own. Through the peephole, she saw a young man standing on her porch. He couldn't have been more than 30, with dark hair that caught the last rays of sunlight, and kind eyes that reminded her of someone she couldn't quite place. He wore a simple button-down shirt and jeans, and in his hands, he held what looked like a small wooden box. Eleanor hesitated. She'd lived through enough decades to know that strangers at your door after sunset rarely brought good news. But something about this young man's posture, respectful, almost apologetic, made her turn the deadbolt. "Mrs. Hartwell?" His voice was gentle, with a slight tremor that suggested nervousness. "I'm Daniel Morrison. I'm sorry to bother you so late in the evening." "Morrison?" Eleanor's mind raced through decades of neighbors, searching for the connection. "I don't believe I know any Morrisons." "No, ma'am, you probably wouldn't. But my grandfather, his name was Walter. Walter Brennan. He lived on Oak Street when you were younger." The name hit Eleanor like a physical blow. Walter Brennan. She gripped the doorframe, her knuckles white against the painted wood. She remembered Walter, a gangly teenager with freckles and a nervous laugh who had lived 3 houses down. He'd been one of Tommy's friends, or at least an acquaintance. They'd gone to school together, played baseball in the same sandlot behind the grocery store. "Walter," she whispered. "I remember Walter. He passed away last month." Daniel continued, and Eleanor could see the grief still fresh in his eyes. "Cancer. But before he died, he gave me some things. Things he said belonged to your family. He made me promise to bring them to you." Eleanor's breath caught. In all her 75 years, she'd learned to be suspicious of promises made by dying men. They often carried weights too heavy for the living to bear. "What kind of things?" she asked, though part of her already knew. Part of her had been waiting for this moment for 60 years. Daniel opened the wooden box with careful hands. Inside, nestled in faded velvet, was a pocket watch. Even in the dim porch light, Eleanor could see the intricate engravings on its silver surface, the delicate chain that had once hung from a boy's vest pocket. Her legs went weak. "This was Tommy's," she breathed. "Your brother's, yes, ma'am. And there's this." Daniel pulled out an envelope, yellowed with age, her name written across the front in handwriting she didn't recognize. "Grandfather Walter wrote you a letter. He said you deserved to know the truth." Eleanor's hands shook as she took the envelope. The paper felt fragile, as if it might crumble at her touch. 60 years. For 60 years, she'd wondered what happened to her little brother that summer night in 1963. For 60 years, she'd imagined every possible scenario: kidnapping, running away, accidents. She dreamed of him as a man living somewhere far away, maybe with a family of his own, maybe unable to come home for reasons she couldn't understand. The police had given up after 5 years. Her parents had died still believing Tommy might walk through their front door someday. Eleanor had spent her entire adult life carrying the weight of not knowing, of searching every crowd for a face that would never age beyond 15. "How did your grandfather have this?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Daniel shifted uncomfortably. "Ma'am, I think you should read the letter. He made me promise not to tell you myself. He said the words needed to be his." Eleanor looked at this young man, This stranger who'd appeared at her door like an angel of revelation, and saw something in his eyes that made her stomach clench. Guilt. Sorrow. The kind of pain that gets passed down through generations like a family heirloom nobody wants to inherit. "Would you like to come in?" she asked, stepping back from the door. Daniel shook his head. "I think this is something you need to read alone first. But Mrs. Hartwell, I want you to know, my grandfather was a good man. He carried something heavy his whole life, and I think he never forgave himself for it." Eleanor nodded, clutching the envelope to her chest. "Will you come back tomorrow? I might have questions." "Yes, ma'am. I'm staying at the Millbrook Inn until you've had time to process everything. Here's my number." He handed her a small piece of paper. "Mrs. Hartwell? I'm sorry. I'm so sorry about your brother." As Daniel walked down her porch steps and disappeared into the summer darkness, Eleanor stood in her doorway holding the two things that would change everything she thought she knew about the worst night of her life. The pocket watch was warm in her palm, as if it had been waiting all these years to come home. The letter felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. She closed the door and locked it, then walked slowly to her kitchen table. The same table where she'd eaten breakfast with Tommy on his last morning. The same table where the police had spread out maps and asked her the same questions over and over. Where did Tommy like to go? Who were his friends? Had he seemed upset about anything? She never mentioned Walter Brennan to the police. Why would she? He was just another kid from the neighborhood, quiet and unremarkable. She'd assumed he'd been questioned like all the other children, had assumed he told them everything he knew. But as Eleanor sat at that familiar table, holding her brother's watch and a letter that had taken 60 years to reach her, she realized that some secrets were too heavy to carry alone. And sometimes, the truth took a lifetime to find its way home. With trembling fingers, she opened the envelope and began to read. The handwriting was shaky, the words of a man fighting against time and failing strength. Eleanor had to squint to make out the first line, and when she did, her heart nearly stopped. "Dear Eleanor, my name is Walter Brennan, but you probably remember me as the scrawny kid who lived on Oak Street. I played baseball with Tommy sometimes, though I was never as good as he was. I was never as good as Tommy at anything, really. He had a light in him that made everyone want to be around him. You probably don't remember me much, and that's okay. I spent most of my life trying to be invisible. I'm dying now. The doctors say I have maybe a week left, and I can't take this secret with me to the grave. I've carried it for 60 years, and it's eaten away at me like the cancer that's eating away at my body. I should have told the truth that night. I should have been brave like Tommy always was. But I was 15 and scared, and I made a choice that destroyed more lives than just his." Eleanor's hands were shaking so badly she had to set the letter down on the table. She pressed her palms flat against the wood, trying to steady herself. Tommy had been brave. Even as a child, he'd been the one to catch spiders and carry them outside instead of squashing them. He'd been the one to stand up to bullies, to help their elderly neighbor Mrs. Chen with her groceries, to sneak extra food to the stray cats that lived behind the church. She picked up the letter again, her eyes burning. That night in July, the night Tommy disappeared, he didn't run away. He didn't get kidnapped. He died because of me. We'd been planning it for weeks, a stupid prank we thought would be hilarious. There was this old quarry on the edge of town, the one everyone said was haunted. The adults always told us to stay away, said it was dangerous, but that just made us want to go there more. Tommy had this idea that we could sneak out there at night and set off some firecrackers, make it look like the ghost was real. We thought we'd scare the whole town. I was supposed to meet him at the corner of Maple and 3rd at midnight. I almost didn't go. My parents had been fighting all week, and I was afraid they'd check on me. But Tommy was counting on me, and I'd never had a real friend before. Not like him. We walked to the quarry in the dark, whispering and laughing like we were the cleverest kids in the world. Tommy brought the firecrackers he'd been saving from the 4th of July. I brought matches and a flashlight. We thought we were so smart. The quarry was different at night. Scarier. The water looked black, and the rocks around the edge were slippery with dew. Tommy wasn't afraid though. He never was. He walked right up to the edge and started setting up the firecrackers on this flat rock that jutted out over the water. I was behind him, holding the flashlight, when I heard the car. Someone was coming down the access road. We panicked. Tommy grabbed the firecrackers and started running along the quarry's edge, trying to get to the trees where we could hide. But it was dark, and the rocks were wet, and he was moving too fast. I'll never forget the sound he made when he fell. Not a scream, just this surprised little, oh sound, like he couldn't believe what was happening. Then the sound of his body hitting the rocks. Then silence. Eleanor's vision blurred. She could see it happening, could see her baby brother falling in the dark, alone and afraid. She could see Walter standing there with his flashlight, watching her brother die. I should have gone to him. I should have climbed down and tried to help him. But I was 15 and terrified, and all I could think about was getting in trouble. The car was getting closer, and I could hear voices. So I ran. I ran home and climbed back through my bedroom window and pretended I'd been asleep the whole time. I told myself he was probably okay. I told myself he'd probably just gotten scared and run home too. But the next morning, when your parents called the police, when the whole town started looking for him, I knew. I knew he was still down there at the bottom of the quarry, and I said nothing. I watched your family tear itself apart looking for him. I watched your mother cry at the grocery store. I watched your father drive around town every night for months, calling Tommy's name. I watched you grow up carrying the weight of not knowing, and I said nothing. I moved away when I turned 18. I couldn't stand living in that house, seeing your family every day, knowing what I'd done. I married a good woman, had children, built a life. But I never stopped thinking about Tommy. I never stopped seeing his face in the dark water. I know you'll probably hate me. I know you'll probably think I'm a coward, and you'd be right. But I need you to know that Tommy didn't suffer. The fall, it was quick. He didn't drown. He didn't call for help while I ran away. He was gone before he hit the water. His watch came off when he fell. I found it the next day when I went back to look for him. I told myself I was going to give it to the police, but I never did. I kept it all these years, and I don't know why. Maybe as punishment. Maybe as a reminder. I'm sorry, Eleanor. I'm sorry for taking your brother away. I'm sorry for stealing 60 years of answers from you. I'm sorry for being too much of a coward to tell you sooner. The quarry has been filled and now turned into a park. But Tommy is still there, somewhere under all that earth and grass. Maybe knowing that will give you some peace. Walter Brennan. Eleanor set the letter down and stared at the pocket watch lying next to it. Tommy's watch. The one he'd been so proud of, the one their grandfather had given him for his 15th birthday just 2 months before he died. For 60 years, she'd imagined Tommy living somewhere far away, maybe with a family of his own. For 60 years, she'd held on to the hope that someday he might come home. Now she knew the truth. Tommy had been 15 minutes away from home, lying at the bottom of a quarry, while she'd spent her entire life waiting for him to walk through the door. The grief hit her like a physical blow. She doubled over in her chair, clutching her stomach, making sounds she didn't recognize as her own voice. Tommy was gone. Really, truly gone. Had been gone for 60 years while she'd been saving his Christmas presents and setting a place for him at Thanksgiving dinner. And Walter Brennan, that quiet, unremarkable boy, had let her family suffer for 6 decades rather than face the truth of what he'd done. Eleanor sat at her kitchen table, holding her brother's watch, and finally allowed herself to mourn the boy who'd been deceased longer than he'd been alive. Eleanor didn't sleep that night. She sat in her living room as the hours crawled by, turning Tommy's watch over and over in her hands, feeling the weight of 60 years of lies settling on her shoulders like a heavy blanket. At dawn, she made coffee with shaking hands and tried to piece together what this truth meant for everything she'd believed about her life. Tommy hadn't run away because he was unhappy. He hadn't been kidnapped by strangers. He'd died trying to have an adventure with a friend, died because he was 15 and brave and thought he was invincible. The sound of her doorbell made her jump. Through the peephole, she saw Daniel Morrison standing on her porch, looking like he hadn't slept either. "Mrs. Hartwell? I know it's early, but I saw your lights were on. I wanted to check on you." She opened the door, and Daniel's face crumpled when he saw her. She probably looked like she'd aged a decade overnight. "You read it," he said quietly. Eleanor nodded, stepping aside to let him in. "Would you like some coffee?" They sat at her kitchen table, the letters spread between them like evidence of a crime. Daniel stared at his hands while Eleanor studied this young man who carried his grandfather's guilt in his eyes. "How long have you known?" she asked. "Since I was 12. Grandfather Walter had been drinking, something he rarely did, and it all came pouring out. He made me promise never to tell anyone while he was alive. He said it would destroy what was left of his family." Eleanor felt a spike of anger. "What about my family? What about what it destroyed for us?" I know, and I'm sorry. I used to lie awake at night thinking about you, wondering if you were still alive, still waiting for answers. I wanted to tell you so many times." Eleanor looked around her kitchen, at the photos on her refrigerator, at the calendar on her wall. In 3 weeks, it would be the anniversary of Tommy's disappearance. The same anniversary that had marked her life for 60 years. "Do you know what this town does every July 15th? She asked Daniel. He shook his head. "They have a memorial service. Tommy Hartwell Memorial Day, they call it. They gather in the town square and light candles and talk about the boy who vanished. There's a plaque now, dedicated to all the missing children who never came home. The mayor gives a speech about community safety and watching out for our neighbors." Eleanor's voice grew bitter. "There have been newspaper articles. A documentary crew came through 5 years ago, interviewing people about the Millbrook mystery. They made Tommy into a legend, a ghost story parents tell their children to keep them from wandering off alone." She stood up abruptly, pacing to the window. "Mrs. Chen from down the street still asks me every Christmas if I've heard anything about Tommy. The librarian keeps a missing persons file with his photo in it. The police chief, he's the son of the officer who worked Tommy's case, he stops by every few years to tell me they haven't forgotten, they're still looking." Daniel watched her, his face pale. "I didn't know about all that." "Of course you didn't. You left town. You got to escape the story your grandfather created." Eleanor turned back to him, her eyes blazing. "But I've lived in this story for 60 years. I've been the sister of the missing boy my entire adult life. People look at me with pity, like I'm some tragic figure frozen in time." She picked up the letter, waving it in the air. "And now I find out it was all a lie. Tommy isn't missing. He's been finished this whole time, and this entire town has been living in a fantasy." Daniel stood up, his hands spread in a gesture of helplessness. "What do you want to do?" Eleanor stared at him. What did she want to do? Part of her wanted to scream, to drive to the cemetery where Walter Brennan was buried and rage at his headstone. Part of her wanted to call the police, to demand justice for a crime that was 60 years old, and committed by a deceased man. But another part of her, the part that had spent decades wondering and hoping, felt something unexpected. Relief. Finally, she knew what had happened to her brother. "I don't know," she admitted. "I honestly don't know. The town doesn't have to know," Daniel said quietly. "The letter, the watch, they're yours now. You could keep the secret, let people go on believing what they've always believed." Eleanor looked at Tommy's watch, glinting in the morning sunlight. "But that's what Walter did, isn't it? He kept the secret, and look how that turned out." She thought about the memorial service, about the candles and the speeches and the plaque in the town square. She thought about the documentary crew, about the articles calling Tommy's disappearance one of the great unsolved mysteries of small-town America. "They've turned my brother into a myth," she said slowly. "He's not a real person to them anymore. He's just a story they tell, a cautionary tale about stranger danger and children who disappear in the night." Daniel nodded. "Maybe the truth would set him free." Eleanor looked at this young man who had carried a terrible burden for years, who had knocked on her door with the courage his grandfather had never found. Maybe it would set us all free. But even as she said it, she wondered if she was strong enough to face the town's reaction. Would they be angry that she'd shattered their myth? Would they blame her for not knowing sooner? Would they turn away from her, the way people sometimes turned away from uncomfortable truths? I need time to think, she said finally. This changes everything, and I don't know how to process it yet. Daniel nodded. I understand. But Mrs. Hartwell? Whatever you decide, I'll help you. I can't undo what my grandfather did, but I can be here for whatever comes next. Eleanor looked at him. This stranger who wasn't really a stranger, this bearer of terrible news who might also be her salvation, and felt the first stirring of something she hadn't felt in 60 years. Hope. Not the desperate hope that Tommy might still be alive, but the quieter hope that truth, however painful, might finally set her free. 3 days passed before Eleanor called Daniel. 3 days of sleepless nights, of staring at Tommy's watch on her nightstand, of walking through her house seeing her brother's ghost in every corner. She'd barely eaten, barely spoken to anyone. When Mrs. Chin had knocked to check on her, Eleanor had pretended not to be home. I need to see it, she told Daniel when he answered the phone. I need to see where it happened. Daniel's voice was gentle. Are you sure? The quarry's been filled in. It's Millbrook Community Park now. There's a playground, walking trails. I know what it is now. I've driven past it 100 times. But I need to see it with new eyes. They met at the park entrance on a Wednesday morning when the summer heat was still bearable and the playground was empty except for a few joggers on the trail. Eleanor had brought flowers, white roses from the bush in her backyard, the same kind their mother had always grown. The park was beautiful, she had to admit. Rolling green hills dotted with oak trees, a small pond where ducks paddled lazily in the morning sun. Children's laughter echoed from the playground equipment painted in bright primary colors. It was hard to imagine this peaceful place had once been a dangerous quarry that swallowed teenage boys. It's different than I expected, Eleanor said, clutching the flowers against her chest. Daniel nodded. Grandfather Walter used to drive past here sometimes when I was little. He'd slow down, just stare at the trees. I never understood why until he told me the truth. They walked along the main trail, past families with strollers and elderly couples holding hands. Eleanor tried to picture it as it had been 60 years ago, a gaping hole in the earth, dark water, jagged rocks. The place that had haunted her nightmares even before she knew Tommy had died here. The old access road came in from the east, Daniel said quietly, pointing toward what was now a picnic area. They would have walked in from that direction. Eleanor followed his gesture, trying to imagine 2 15-year-old boys creeping through the darkness, whispering and giggling about their prank. Tommy would have been excited, she knew. He'd always loved adventures, always been the one to suggest exploring the creek behind their house or building forts in the woods. Where exactly did it happen? She asked. Daniel hesitated. According to the letter, it was near the deepest part of the quarry. That would be... He looked around, getting his bearings. Probably right about where that oak tree is. The big one by the pond. They walked toward the tree, Eleanor's steps growing slower with each pace. The oak was massive, its branches spreading wide enough to shade half the pond. Someone had installed a memorial bench beneath it, with a small plaque that read, "In memory of all those who came before us." Eleanor stared at the plaque, a bitter laugh escaping her lips. How fitting. She sat on the bench, still holding the roses. From here, she could see the whole park, the playground where children climbed and swung, the trail where couples walked hand in hand, the pond where families fed ducks on weekend afternoons. All of it built on top of the place where her brother had died. He was just a boy, she said, her voice breaking. 15 years old, trying to impress a friend. He should have grown up, gotten married, had children of his own. He should have lived. Daniel sat beside her, careful to leave space between them. I think about that too. About the life he didn't get to have. Eleanor closed her eyes, and for a moment she could hear it. The sound of teenage laughter, the crunch of gravel under sneakers, the whispered plans of boys who thought they were invincible. She could almost see Tommy running along the quarry's edge, his face bright with mischief, not knowing he had only seconds left to live. "He was afraid of the dark when he was little," she said suddenly. "He'd make me check under his bed for monsters. But that night, he walked into the darkest place in town without hesitation. That's who he was, brave, even when he was scared." She stood up, walking to the edge of the pond. The water was shallow here, clear enough to see the bottom. Nothing like the black depths that had once existed in this place. "I used to dream about him drowning," she continued. "I'd wake up gasping, feeling like I was underwater too. But he didn't drown, did he? Walter said he didn't suffer." "No," Daniel said quietly. "The fall, it would have been quick." Eleanor knelt by the water's edge and placed the white roses on the surface. They floated like small boats, their petals catching the sunlight. "I'm sorry, Tommy," she whispered. "I'm sorry it took me so long to find you. I'm sorry you died alone, and I'm sorry I couldn't save you." The roses drifted on the gentle current, moving slowly across the pond. Eleanor watched them until they disappeared among the cattails on the far shore. "I forgive him," she said suddenly, surprising herself with the words. Daniel looked up sharply. "Walter? He was just a boy too. 15 years old, scared out of his mind. I can't imagine living with that guilt for 60 years. She turned to face Daniel. "I'm not saying what he did was right. He should have gotten help, should have told someone. But I understand why he ran." Daniel's eyes filled with tears. "He never forgave himself. Even at the end, he kept saying he was sorry." Eleanor nodded. "I know. I could hear it in his letter. The pain he carried." She looked around the park one more time, at the life that had grown up over death, at the beauty that had replaced the darkness. "Maybe it's time to let go of the anger. For all of us." They sat in silence for a while, watching the ducks paddle across the pond where Tommy's roses had floated. The morning sun climbed higher, warming their faces, and Eleanor felt something she hadn't felt in 60 years. Peace. Not the peace of ignorance, but the peace of finally knowing. Tommy was here, in this place that had become something beautiful. He was part of the trees and the grass and the water. He was part of the laughter of children playing where he had died. "I know what I need to do," she said finally. Daniel looked at her questioningly. "I need to tell the truth. Not for revenge, not to hurt anyone, but to set Tommy free. To let him be a real person again instead of a mystery." She stood up, brushing dirt from her knees. "Will you help me?" Daniel stood too, his face serious but no longer shadowed with the guilt he'd carried for so long. "Yes. Whatever you need." As they walked back toward the park entrance, Eleanor felt lighter than she had in years. The truth was a terrible thing, but it was also a gift. Finally, after 60 years of not knowing, she could give her brother what he deserved. A proper goodbye. Eleanor sat at her kitchen table that evening, a blank piece of paper in front of her, and Tommy's watch beside her right hand. She'd been staring at the empty page for an hour, trying to find the right words to unravel 60 years of mystery. How do you tell an entire town that the story they've built their identity around is a lie? How do you explain that their ghost is just a boy who fell in the dark? She picked up her pen and began to write. To the editor of the Millbrook Gazette. "My name is Eleanor Hartwell. For 60 years, I have been known in this town as the sister of Tommy Hartwell, the boy who disappeared on July 15, 1963. Today, I am writing to tell you that my brother didn't disappear. He died that night, and I finally know how." Eleanor paused, reading the words back to herself. They looked so stark on the page, so final. She thought about all the people who would read this letter, neighbors who had searched for Tommy, police officers who had worked his case, children who had grown up hearing the story of the boy who vanished. She thought about Mrs. Chin, who still asked about Tommy every Christmas. About the documentary crew who had called him one of the great unsolved mysteries. About the memorial service where they lit candles and spoke of hope and never giving up. Her phone rang. Daniel's name appeared on the screen. "How are you doing?" he asked when she answered. I'm writing the letter. It's harder than I thought it would be. What's making it hard? Eleanor looked around her kitchen, at the photos on her refrigerator, at the calendar marking another anniversary of Tommy's disappearance. I keep thinking about how people will react. Some of them have been invested in this mystery for decades. They've made it part of who they are. And you're worried they'll be angry? I'm worried they'll feel foolish. Like they've been living a lie. She set down her pen. Maybe I should have just kept Walter's secret. Maybe some truths are too heavy to share. Daniel was quiet for a moment. Can I tell you something about my grandfather? Something he said near the end? Of course. He said the worst part wasn't the guilt of what happened that night. It was the guilt of watching your family suffer and doing nothing about it. He said he felt like he was finishing Tommy over and over again, every day that he stayed silent. Eleanor's chest tightened. Daniel. He said that keeping the secret didn't protect anyone. It just spread the pain around, made more people carry pieces of it. Your parents died not knowing what happened to their son. You've spent your whole life waiting for someone who was never coming home. The town has spent 60 years looking for a boy who was never lost. Eleanor picked up her pen again. You think I should tell them? I think Tommy deserves to be more than a mystery. He deserves to be remembered as a real person who lived and laughed and made mistakes and had adventures. Even if his last adventure ended badly. After they hung up, Eleanor returned to her letter. She wrote about the night Tommy died, about Walter's confession, about the accident that had been covered up for 6 decades. She wrote about forgiveness and truth and the weight of secrets. I am not writing this letter to blame Walter Brennan, or to seek revenge against the deceased man. He was 15 years old that night, the same age as my brother. He made a terrible choice born of fear and panic, and he paid for it every day of his life. I am writing this letter because my brother was not a mystery to be solved. He was a boy who loved baseball and hated Brussels sprouts, who collected bottle caps and dreamed of becoming a pilot. He was brave and kind and funny, and he died trying to have an adventure with a friend. The memorial service we hold every year honors the wrong story. We light candles for a boy who disappeared, but Tommy didn't disappear. He died in an accident, and he has been resting in peace beneath what is now Millbrook Community Park for 60 years. I know this news will be difficult for many of you. I know some of you will be angry that I've taken away the mystery you've lived with for so long. But I believe we owe it to Tommy, and to ourselves, to live with truth instead of fantasy. There will be no more searching for my brother. There will be no more wondering if he might still be alive somewhere. There will be no more ghost stories about the boy who vanished. There will only be the memory of a 15-year-old who died too young, and the love of a community that never forgot him. I plan to hold a proper memorial service for Tommy on what would have been his 76th birthday, October 12th. Not for a missing boy, but for a boy who lived and was loved and is finally at peace. Thank you for caring about my brother all these years. Thank you for never giving up on him, even when the truth was something none of us could have imagined. With gratitude and sorrow, Eleanor Hartwell. She read the letter 3 times, making small changes, softening harsh words, adding details that made Tommy feel more real. When she was satisfied, she folded it carefully and placed it in an envelope. Tomorrow, she would drive to the Millbrook Gazette office and hand it to the editor personally. She would look him in the eye and watch his face change as he realized what she was giving him. She would go home and wait for the phone to ring, for the neighbors to arrive, for the town to react to having its foundational story torn away. Some people would be angry. Some would be relieved. Some would grieve all over again for a boy they'd never stopped mourning. But for the first time in 60 years, they would all know the truth. Eleanor picked up Tommy's watch and held it to her ear. It had stopped ticking long ago, frozen at 11:47, probably the exact moment he'd hit the rocks. But tomorrow, when the truth finally came out, time would start moving again. For Tommy. For Walter. For her. And maybe, finally, for the whole town that had been waiting 60 years for a boy to come home. The letter was published on a Thursday morning. By noon, Eleanor's phone had rung 17 times. She didn't answer any of the calls. Instead, she sat in her garden, tending to the white roses that grew along her back fence, the same variety she'd floated on the pond at Millbrook Park. Daniel had offered to stay with her, to help field the inevitable questions and reactions, but Eleanor had declined. This was something she needed to face alone. The first person to actually knock on her door was Mrs. Chin, her elderly neighbor. Eleanor had expected anger, accusations, demands for explanations. Instead, she found the 78-year-old woman standing on her porch with tears streaming down her face and a casserole dish in her hands. "Oh, Eleanor," Mrs. Chin said, wrapping her in a surprisingly strong hug. "Oh, honey. I'm so sorry. All these years, we never knew you were grieving someone who was already gone." More neighbors followed throughout the week. Some came with anger, demanding to know why she'd waited so long to tell the truth. Others came with relief, grateful to finally have answers to questions that had haunted them for decades. Many came with stories, memories of Tommy they'd never shared because they hadn't wanted to upset her while he was missing. "He helped me fix my bicycle chain the week before he died," said Robert Martinez, who lived 4 houses down. "I was crying because I couldn't ride to baseball practice, and Tommy just appeared with his toolbox. Never asked for anything in return. He always saved the best comic books for me at the library," added Sarah Beth, now a grandmother herself. "I was too shy to ask for them, but Tommy would set them aside and make sure I saw them before anyone else." The stories painted a picture of her brother that Eleanor had almost forgotten, not the tragic figure of a missing child, but a real boy who had touched lives in small, ordinary ways. The town's reaction was exactly as complicated as Eleanor had expected. The mayor called, asking if she wanted to cancel the annual memorial service. The police chief stopped by to formally close the case file. The local historical society requested an interview for their archives. But the most unexpected visitor came on a rainy afternoon 2 weeks after the letter was published. A woman in her 50s knocked on Eleanor's door, holding a small boy's hand. "Mrs. Hartwell? My name is Rebecca Brennan Torres. Walter Brennan was my father." Eleanor's breath caught. She saw the resemblance immediately, the same kind eyes, the same nervous way of holding her shoulders. "This is my son, Matthew," Rebecca continued. "He's 6, and when he heard about your brother, he wanted to give you something." The little boy stepped forward shyly and held out a drawing. It showed 2 stick figures standing under a tree, with flowers floating on water nearby. At the top, in crayon letters, he'd written, "Tommy and Eleanor friends forever." "Grandpa Walter told us about Tommy before he died," Rebecca explained. "He said Tommy was the bravest kid he ever knew, and he wanted us to remember him. When Matthew heard you were sad, he wanted to help." Eleanor knelt down to Matthew's level, studying his drawing. "This is beautiful." "Thank you." "Is Tommy in heaven now?" Matthew asked solemnly. Eleanor looked up at Rebecca, then back at the little boy who carried his great-grandfather's guilt in a family that had learned to speak truth instead of hiding from it. "Yes," she said. "I think he is." 3 months later, on October 12th, Tommy's 76th birthday, Eleanor stood before a crowd gathered in Millbrook Community Park. Not at the memorial plaque with its generic dedication, but under the great oak tree where her brother had died. The crowd was smaller than the annual memorial services had been, but it felt more real. These weren't people drawn by mystery and spectacle. These were people who had actually known Tommy, or who wanted to honor his memory properly. Eleanor had spent weeks preparing her speech, but when the moment came, she set aside her notes and spoke from her heart. "My brother Tommy loved this town," she began. "He loved exploring its creeks and climbing its trees and riding his bicycle down every street until he knew them by heart. He wasn't a ghost story or an unsolved mystery. He was a 15-year-old boy who laughed too loud and ate too much ice cream and believed he could do anything." She looked out at the faces in the crowd, neighbors who had searched for Tommy, friends who had grown up with his story, strangers who had been moved by the truth she'd finally shared. "For 60 years, we've been waiting for Tommy to come home. But he was already home. He's been here all along, in this place that's become beautiful, in the memories of people who loved him, in the kindness he showed to others when he was alive. Daniel stood near the back of the crowd, holding flowers he'd brought from his own garden. Rebecca and little Matthew sat on a blanket nearby, the boys drawing tucked safely in Eleanor's purse. "So we're not here to solve a mystery today," Eleanor continued. "We're here to celebrate a life. A short life, but a good one. A life that mattered not because of how it ended, but because of how it was lived." When the service was over, people lingered under the oak tree, sharing more stories about Tommy, talking about the weight of secrets and the freedom of truth. Children played on the nearby playground, their laughter echoing across the water where white roses still bloomed along the shore. Eleanor stayed until the sun set, sitting on the memorial bench with Tommy's watch in her hands. For the first time in 60 years, she wasn't waiting for her brother to come home. He was already there, in the rustling of the oak leaves above her head, in the gentle lapping of water against the shore, in the peace that finally filled the empty spaces in her heart. Tommy was home. And so, at last, was she.